Someone touches the smooth, glowing surface of an evening gown at a formal event and says, with total, unhesitating confidence, that it must be silk, the way people so often do when they encounter something that catches the light in exactly that particular liquid, luminous way. Statistically, they are almost certainly wrong about that guess, and wrong in a way that reveals something genuinely surprising about how fabric names actually work. That gown is far more likely to be polyester, and yet it will still be called satin, and it will still deserve that name completely, because here is the twist most people never learn. Satin was never a fiber to begin with. It is a weave, a specific, deliberately engineered structure of interlacing threads that can be built out of silk or out of a completely synthetic filament invented barely a century ago. And either way, the fabric earns exactly the same name. This is the real story of satin, a technique so specifically designed to showcase silk's natural shine that it eventually became so popular, so widely desired, and so successfully copied in cheaper materials that it managed to outlive silk's dominance entirely, thriving today overwhelmingly in fibers that have nothing whatsoever to do with silkworms at all. To understand how a weaving technique ends up more famous and more enduring than the material it was originally built to flatter, we need to start somewhere most people have never heard of. A medieval Chinese port city that guarded its weaving secret so effectively that the Western world barely knew its real name, and instead remembered it by a garbled version that eventually became the word sitting on your clothing tag today. During the Song and Yuan dynasties, the southeastern Chinese port city of Quanzhou grew into one of the most important maritime trading hubs in the entire medieval world. A bustling harbor where ships from across Asia, the Middle East, and eventually Europe converged to trade goods flowing along both sea routes and the overland Silk Road network. Quanzhou's Arabic and Persian trading partners commonly referred to the city using a name that transliterated roughly as Zaitun, and it was through this specific name, passed along trade routes and eventually recorded by European travelers, including the Venetian merchant traveler Marco Polo in his widely circulated travel accounts, that the city's reputation for extraordinary silk textiles spread westward. Marco Polo's descriptions of Zaitun portrayed it as one of the greatest ports in the world, a place of staggering wealth and constant commercial activity across many decades. And among the many goods that made the city genuinely legendary across foreign trading circles was a specific type of silk fabric, woven using a technique that produced an extraordinarily smooth, lustrous, almost liquid-looking surface, unlike anything most foreign traders had previously encountered in their travels. Quanzhou's rise to prominence during this period was itself a genuinely remarkable story of maritime commercial development. The city benefited from a naturally sheltered harbor, favorable positioning along established monsoon trade wind patterns that made seasonal voyages to and from Southeast Asia, India, and the Arabian Peninsula considerably more predictable, and sustained government investment in port infrastructure during a period when Chinese maritime trade policy actively encouraged foreign commercial activity rather than restricting it. Foreign merchant communities, including substantial populations of Arab and Persian traders, established permanent residential quarters within the city, creating a genuinely cosmopolitan trading environment where goods, technical knowledge, and cultural practices moved in multiple directions simultaneously, rather than flowing along any single dominant trade relationship. This cosmopolitan character meant that when Zaitun's silk workshops did produce something as visually striking as satin weave fabric, the finished product had an unusually well-established, ready-made distribution network of foreign merchants eager to carry it onward to markets these traders already regularly serviced across the wider medieval trading world. This is where we need to pause and actually understand what made this specific weave so visually different from ordinary silk fabric. Because the technical explanation is genuinely the key to this entire story. And skipping past it means missing why satin became so desirable in the first place. Most basic woven fabric, including plain weave cloth, is constructed using a simple over-under pattern, where the horizontal weft thread passes over one vertical warp thread, then under the next, then over the next, alternating constantly across the entire fabric. This frequent interlacing creates a textile surface with a lot of small interruptions, and each interruption scatters incoming light in a slightly different direction, which is part of why ordinary plain weave fabric tends to look relatively matte rather than shiny, regardless of how lustrous the underlying fiber itself might be. Satin weave abandons this frequent alternation entirely. Instead, the weft thread floats over 4, 5, 6, or even more warp threads before finally interlacing, then floats over several more before the next interlacing point. And this specific structural choice means the fabric's surface is dominated by long, unbroken runs of thread lying essentially flat and parallel, rather than constantly bending up and over its neighbors. Flat, parallel thread surfaces reflect light coherently rather than scattering it randomly. And that coherent reflection is precisely what produces the smooth, glowing, almost mirror-like sheen that makes satin instantly recognizable by sight and by touch, even to someone who has never heard the word woven into a single sentence about textile engineering. It's worth briefly distinguishing satin weave from the other major weave family most people have at least some passing familiarity with. Twill weave, the diagonal ribbed structure found in denim and many suit fabrics, because the comparison helps clarify exactly what makes satin's specific engineering choice so distinctive. Twill weave also uses extended interlacing patterns compared to simple plain weave, but it staggers each successive row's interlacing point by a consistent offset, which is precisely what creates twill's recognizable diagonal rib pattern running across the fabric's surface. Satin weave, by contrast, deliberately scatters its interlacing points as widely and as irregularly as possible across the fabric, specifically avoiding any consistent diagonal alignment, since any visible ridge or rib pattern would interrupt the smooth, uniform light reflection that defines satin's entire visual purpose. This distinction means satin weave requires genuinely more sophisticated loom setup and thread tension control than either plain weave or twill weave to execute successfully and consistently across a full bolt of finished fabric, since the weaver must carefully track and distribute interlacing points across a much wider repeating pattern, typically a minimum of 5 threads before repeating in traditional satin weave structures, compared to the comparatively simple 2 or 3 thread repeat pattern found in basic plain and twill weaves respectively. Silk fibers happen to be an almost perfect match for this specific weave structure, and understanding why adds another layer to why Zaitun satin became so legendary, rather than just another regional specialty. Silk filament is naturally smooth, fine, and has a distinctive triangular cross-sectional structure at the microscopic level that refracts light in a particularly attractive way even in ordinary weaves, which is part of why silk fabric in general has always carried a reputation for luxury, regardless of how it's constructed. Combine that naturally lustrous fiber with a weave structure specifically engineered to maximize surface light reflection, and you get a textile effect that genuinely had no widespread equivalent anywhere else in the medieval textile world. A combination of raw material quality and structural engineering working together rather than either one doing all the work alone. Given how visually striking and commercially valuable this technique clearly was, it should come as no surprise that the weavers and workshops of Zaitun treated their specific methods as closely guarded trade knowledge rather than something to be casually shared with competitors or foreign visitors. Historical accounts from the period describe a broader pattern common across many specialized Chinese textile centers during this era, where specific techniques, dye recipes, and weaving structures were maintained as workshop or even family secrets, passed down through direct apprenticeship rather than documented in any form accessible to outsiders. This secrecy wasn't unique to satin weaving specifically, but it does help explain why the technique's exact mechanical details took a genuinely long time to become fully understood and independently replicated outside of China. even as the finished fabric itself traveled remarkably widely along established trade networks, stretching across thousands of miles of both ocean and overland caravan routes alike. Some historical accounts also suggest that specific families or lineages within Zaitun's broader weaving community may have controlled particularly refined variations of the technique, passing down subtle technical refinements, such as precise thread tension adjustments or specific finishing treatments that enhance the fabric's final sheen, exclusively within direct family lines across multiple generations. A pattern of guarded intergenerational craft knowledge that appears repeatedly across numerous historical textile traditions worldwide, including several other material histories explored elsewhere on this channel. This kind of tightly controlled knowledge transmission served an obvious economic function, protecting a workshop's competitive advantage in an environment where a distinctive, difficult-to-replicate product commanded significantly higher prices than more widely available alternatives. But it also meant that when political upheaval, economic disruption, or simply the natural ending of a family lineage without a willing successor occurred, specific refined variations of the technique could be permanently lost, even while the broader general principle of satin weaving continued to spread and develop elsewhere. If the technique was this carefully guarded, how did satin eventually become a fabric produced and beloved across an entirely different continent, in European workshops that had never received any direct instruction from Zaitun's original weavers? The answer involves a combination of trade exposure, painstaking technical reverse engineering, and eventually genuine independent innovation, a pattern that echoes something we've traced with other prized materials on this channel, where a technique's original secrecy rarely survives indefinitely once the finished product proves commercially valuable enough to attract sustained outside attention. Finished satin weave silk fabric traveled westward along Silk Road trade networks for centuries, reaching Middle Eastern markets and eventually European ports as an exceptionally prized luxury import, admired specifically for that distinctive glowing surface that set it apart from other available silk textiles of the era. European textile centers, particularly the increasingly sophisticated silk weaving industries developing across several Italian city-states during the medieval and early Renaissance periods, gained access to both finished satin fabric as a reference example and, gradually, to enough technical understanding of silk weaving generally to begin experimenting with reproducing similar weave structures using their own emerging expertise. Italian cities, including Venice, Genoa, Lucca, and Florence, had each developed substantial domestic silk industries by drawing on imported raw silk, imported technical knowledge, and skilled immigrant weavers, particularly following periods of political upheaval that sometimes pushed skilled textile workers to relocate from established Byzantine and Middle Eastern weaving centers toward new opportunities in Italian city-states, eager to build their own luxury textile reputation. Venice's relationship with silk textile production deserves particular attention within this broader Italian development, since the city's unique position as a dominant Mediterranean trading power gave it especially direct and sustained exposure to imported Eastern luxury goods, including satin weave silk fabric arriving through established trade relationships with Byzantine and, eventually, Ottoman territories, alongside more distant Chinese goods that had already passed through several intermediate trading hands before reaching Venetian merchants. Venetian guild records from this period document increasingly sophisticated silk weaving regulations, including detailed technical standards governing thread count, weave quality, and even specific terminology distinguishing different silk fabric types. Evidence of an industry investing seriously in formalizing and protecting its own accumulating technical expertise, much the way Zaitun's original workshops had guarded theirs centuries earlier. Florence, meanwhile, developed its own substantial silk industry that would eventually become closely intertwined with the city's broader Renaissance era. Wealth and artistic patronage, with successful silk merchant families numbering among the same wealthy patron class that commissioned much of the era's celebrated artwork, meaning satin and other fine silk textiles, were, in a very direct economic sense, helping fund the broader cultural flowering historians now associate with Renaissance Florence. By examining imported satin fabric closely, and through gradual technical experimentation informed by their broader accumulated silk weaving expertise, Italian workshops eventually succeeded in reproducing the essential structural principle behind satin weave. That specific pattern of extended thread floats punctuated by comparatively infrequent interlacing points, without ever receiving direct instruction from the original Chinese source. This kind of independent technical reconstruction, achieved purely through careful observation and accumulated craft knowledge, is a pattern worth appreciating on its own terms, since it represents genuine engineering achievement rather than simple imitation. Even though the finished product's visual appeal was directly inspired by an imported example the European weavers had never been formally taught to replicate. This is also where the fabric's name itself completes its own journey, and the linguistic trail is genuinely worth tracing closely because it connects directly back to that original secretive port city in a way most people wearing satin today have absolutely no idea about. As this weave structure and its associated finished fabric became increasingly known and traded across the Mediterranean world, the name most commonly used to refer to it derived through a chain of linguistic adaptation across Arabic and then Italian and eventually French usage from that same city name, Zaitun, gradually shifting in pronunciation and spelling until it emerged in Italian as something close to setino and in French as satin, the exact word that would eventually pass into English and countless other languages essentially unchanged from its French form. Every time someone today refers to a satin dress, a satin pillowcase, or satin sheets, they are, without any awareness of it, invoking the name of a medieval Chinese port city whose specific weaving secrets traveled far enough and impressed enough foreign traders that its own name eventually became permanently attached to an entire category of fabric, regardless of what fiber that fabric happens to actually be made from today. With European workshops now capable of producing their own satin weave silk fabric domestically, the stage was set for the fabric's next major chapter, a period during which satin transformed from an exotic imported luxury into one of the defining status fabrics of European royal and aristocratic fashion for several centuries running. A transformation worth examining in some detail because the scale of its cultural embedding genuinely surprises people who assume satin has always been a comparatively ordinary, everyday material. European royal courts throughout the late medieval, Renaissance, and Baroque periods increasingly embraced silk satin as a defining fabric of aristocratic and ecclesiastical status. And surviving portraiture from these centuries offers remarkably direct visual evidence of just how thoroughly the fabric became embedded in elite fashion. Formal court garments, ceremonial robes, religious vestments used in significant church ceremonies, and elaborate furnishings including bed hangings and upholstery in the wealthiest households frequently incorporated silk satin specifically for its distinctive light-catching quality, which photographed exceptionally well, or rather, painted exceptionally well in an era before photography existed, when formal portraiture served much the same status documenting function that a well-composed photograph might serve today. Court painters developed genuine technical specialization in rendering satin's distinctive sheen convincingly on canvas, since capturing the fabric's characteristic play of light and shadow across its smooth, reflective surface required specific brushwork techniques distinct from rendering matte fabrics like wool or plain weave linen. A detail art historians studying this period have documented extensively when analyzing how court painters differentiated fabric textures within a single formal portrait. The economic reality underlying this widespread aristocratic embrace deserves genuinely honest attention as well, since silk satin's exclusivity during this era rested on exactly the same fundamental economic logic we've encountered with other historically prized luxury textiles on this channel. An expensive, labor-intensive raw material combined with a weave structure that itself required additional skilled labor and technical precision beyond what simpler weaving patterns demanded. meaning genuine silk satin remained firmly out of reach for anyone outside the wealthiest segments of European society for a very long time. Sumptuary laws in several European countries during this period, formal legal restrictions governing exactly which social classes were legally permitted to wear specific fabrics, including silk satin, further reinforced this exclusivity by making the fabric not just economically inaccessible to most people, but, in some jurisdictions, literally illegal for anyone outside designated noble or wealthy merchant classes to wear at all. A detail that underscores just how seriously European authorities of the era treated fabric choice as a visible, legally regulated marker of social hierarchy. Specific examples of these sumptuary restrictions illustrate just how granular this legal regulation of fabric could become. English sumptuary legislation during various periods of the 15th and 16th centuries specified in considerable detail which ranks of nobility, gentry, and merchant classes were permitted to wear silk satin, sometimes distinguishing further by color, since certain rich dyes used in combination with satin's already prestigious weave structure were considered doubly exclusive markers reserved for only the highest ranks of society. Similar sumptuary codes appeared across various Italian city-states, French territories, and other European jurisdictions, though enforcement varied considerably by period and location, and historians studying these laws generally note they were as much about anxious elite attempts to maintain visible social distinction during periods of growing merchant-class wealth, as they were about any genuine practical concern regarding fabric scarcity itself. Wealthy merchants who had accumulated fortunes through trade rather than inherited noble title represented a particular source of anxiety for established aristocratic classes, since such merchants could often genuinely afford the same fine fabrics as nobility, and sumptuary law represented one of the few remaining tools available to enforce a visible social hierarchy that accumulating merchant wealth was otherwise beginning to blur considerably. Given how firmly satin's reputation became tied to genuine silk exclusivity across these several centuries, a natural question emerges. How did this fabric eventually become common enough to appear in mass-market bridal gowns, everyday lingerie, and inexpensive lining fabrics sold at accessible prices in ordinary retail stores worldwide? The answer, much like the chrome tanning breakthrough that transformed leather production or the wet spinning innovation that transformed flax processing, both stories we've covered elsewhere on this channel, comes down to a specific chapter of industrial chemistry that fundamentally decoupled the satin weave structure from any dependency on actual silk fiber whatsoever. The first major development in this direction arrived with the invention and commercial development of rayon during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a semi-synthetic fiber manufactured by chemically processing cellulose, typically derived from wood pulp or cotton linters, into a filament that could be spun and woven in ways that closely mimicked several of silk's most desirable physical properties, including a comparable smooth texture and a reasonably attractive sheen, all while being manufactured at a dramatically lower cost than raising silkworms and reeling their cocoons ever could achieve. Rayon quickly became a genuinely popular substitute fiber for satin weave production specifically, since the weave structure itself, that extended thread float pattern responsible for satin's signature glow, worked effectively with rayon filament nearly as well as it had always worked with genuine silk, meaning manufacturers could now produce a fabric with satin's visual and tactile signature at a fraction of silk's historical cost, immediately expanding the fabric's potential market far beyond the aristocratic and wealthy merchant classes who had exclusively enjoyed it for centuries. Rayon's own development story is worth a brief detour, since the fiber's path to commercial viability involved several decades of experimentation and more than one significant technical dead end before manufacturers arrived at production methods safe and consistent enough for genuine, large-scale textile use. Early experimental cellulose fiber production processes developed during the late 19th century sometimes involved genuinely hazardous chemical processes, and it took considerable further industrial refinement, particularly the development of the viscose process patented in the final years of the 19th century. before cellulose-based fiber production became practical enough to support the kind of large-scale textile manufacturing that would eventually make rayon satin a genuinely common, affordable fabric, available well beyond specialized luxury markets. By the 1920s and 30s, rayon had become sufficiently established that fashion industry publications of the era openly discussed and marketed rayon satin garments as a fashionable, accessible alternative to silk, representing a notable shift in how openly manufacturers were willing to advertise a fabric's synthetic or semi-synthetic origins rather than attempting to disguise it as genuine silk. Since rayon satin's affordability was, by this point, considered a selling point in its own right rather than something to obscure from potential customers. The truly decisive transformation, however, arrived with the development and mass commercialization of fully synthetic petroleum-based fibers throughout the 20th century, most significantly nylon, developed and commercially introduced in the late 1930s, and polyester, which followed in subsequent decades and eventually became the single most common fiber used in satin weave production worldwide by a considerable margin. These fully synthetic fibers offered manufacturers even greater consistency, durability, and cost efficiency than rayon had achieved, and critically, they responded exceptionally well to the specific mechanical demands of satin weaving, since consistent filament thickness and smoothness genuinely matter for achieving that signature, uninterrupted light reflection the weave structure depends upon. A requirement synthetic fiber production could meet with industrial precision that natural silk, subject to all the biological variation inherent in an agricultural product, could never fully match at comparable scale or cost. This synthetic transformation effectively severed the centuries-old assumption that satin necessarily meant silk, and it did so within a remarkably compressed historical time frame compared to the many centuries satin had spent as an exclusively silk-based luxury fabric. By the mid to late 20th century, the overwhelming majority of satin fabric produced and sold worldwide was manufactured from polyester or other synthetic fibers rather than silk, a genuinely dramatic reversal from the fabric's entire prior history, and one that occurred quietly enough that most consumers today simply absorbed the word satin as referring to a fabric's look and feel, rather than pausing to consider what specific fiber might be responsible for producing that look and feel in any given garment they happen to be wearing or purchasing. This brings us to the specific irony embedded directly in this episode's title, and it's worth stating plainly rather than leaving it implied. Satin, a weave structure originally developed and perfected specifically to showcase silk's uniquely lustrous natural properties, has now thoroughly outlived silk's practical dominance within its own namesake category. Genuine silk satin, sometimes marketed today under the related but technically distinct name silk charmeuse to help distinguish it from the vastly more common synthetic alternative, now occupies a comparatively small, distinctly premium niche within the broader satin market. While synthetic satin, produced at massive industrial scale and sold at a small fraction of silk satin's cost, dominates everything from mass-market bridal wear to inexpensive lingerie to the satin ribbon wrapped around countless retail gift boxes worldwide. The weave technique proved, in the end, considerably more durable and more widely adaptable than the specific fiber that originally made it famous. A genuinely unusual outcome when you consider that the entire weave structure was engineered from the beginning around maximizing one particular fiber's specific optical properties. Modern satin production today reflects this synthetic dominance clearly across global manufacturing patterns, with countries including China once again playing a significant role in a story that began within its own borders centuries earlier, alongside other major textile manufacturing centers across Asia, producing the overwhelming majority of the world's satin fabric using polyester and other synthetic fibers at industrial scale, while genuine silk satin production remains comparatively limited and concentrated in regions maintaining specialized silk industries including certain areas of China, India, and parts of Europe that preserved dedicated silk weaving traditions through the centuries of gradual synthetic displacement occurring around them. This modern production landscape also reflects an interesting parallel to patterns we've traced with other materials on this channel, where accumulated technical expertise in a specific region persists and finds new economic relevance even after the original raw material driving that expertise has been substantially displaced. Chinese silk weaving regions, including areas with weaving traditions tracing back many centuries, have in some cases successfully transitioned significant portions of their manufacturing capacity toward synthetic satin production, applying generations of accumulated weaving technical knowledge, including sophisticated understanding of thread tension, loom calibration, and finishing techniques, to synthetic fiber inputs rather than exclusively to silk, meaning the region's genuine textile expertise proved considerably more durable and adaptable than any single raw material dependency ever could have been on its own. This adaptability offers a genuinely useful, broader lesson about how textile industries survive major material transitions over time. The specific technical knowledge embedded in a weaving community, the accumulated understanding of how to coax a particular visual and tactile effect out of interlacing threads often outlasts and outperforms attachment to any single specific fiber, provided that community has the flexibility and resources to adapt its accumulated expertise toward whatever new material happens to become economically dominant. There's a particular pattern worth sitting with as we bring this story to a close, one that connects directly to several other material histories we've explored on this channel. A technique or a name, once established through genuine innovation and guarded secrecy in one specific place, can travel, get copied, get industrially reinvented, and ultimately become almost completely detached from its original geographic and material origins, while somehow still carrying that origin's name forward across centuries and, in this specific case, across an entirely different category of raw material altogether. Zaitun's silk weavers developed a specific structural technique to showcase silk's natural shine within their own guarded workshops, a technique so visually striking that foreign traders carried both the finished fabric and eventually a garbled version of the city's own name westward along trade routes spanning thousands of miles. European weavers reverse-engineered the structural principle without ever learning the original technique directly, built their own substantial luxury industry and centuries of aristocratic fashion tradition around it. And then, eventually, industrial chemists severed the technique from silk entirely, proving that the specific arrangement of threads mattered more to the fabric's lasting commercial success than the biological origin of those threads ever did. If there's one thread worth pulling from everything this episode has covered, it's this. The word on a fabric label sometimes describes a raw material, but sometimes, as we've now seen clearly with satin, it describes a technique instead, a specific engineered relationship between threads that can survive and thrive across entirely different materials, centuries, and continents once it proves visually and commercially compelling enough. This distinction matters well beyond satin itself, since it offers a genuinely useful lens for thinking about textile names generally. A reminder that the word printed on a garment tag might be telling you about geography, about raw material, about a specific historical workshop's reputation, or, as satin demonstrates so clearly, about nothing more or less than a particular arrangement of interlacing threads first perfected in a port city most people wearing the fabric today have never once heard of. The next time you touch something satin and instinctively assume silk, remember that you're actually invoking the name of a medieval Chinese port, city's guarded weaving secret, a technique so effective at catching and reflecting light that it eventually outgrew the very fiber that first made it famous, thriving today in synthetic filaments that wouldn't exist for another 6 centuries after Zaitun's weavers first perfected the structural principle underlying it all, a technique built around silk's optical properties now doing its job just as effectively for a chemical fiber that no silkworm ever produced. If you found this journey through a secretive Chinese port, Renaissance Italian workshops, European royal courts, and 20th century industrial chemistry, as surprising as we did. There's a lot more fabric history where this came from, so stick around. Because the words we use for the clothes we wear rarely describe quite what we assume they describe once you actually trace them back to where they began. And satin, it turns out, was never really about silk at all. It was always about light and thread and the specific, deliberate arrangement of one across the other.